Welcome to the second part of In Touch. This is Crime Beat with Officer Don and Fayette Commonwealth's attorney Ray Larson. This week we're going to talk about a couple of things. In 1988, Deputy Sheriff Joe Angelucci was attempting to arrest a person, this William Bennett. Mr. Bennett killed Deputy Angelucci, and he's up for parole now. They're actually going to try to let this guy out of prison, so we'll discuss that. Plus, Dr. Conrad Murray has been convicted of manslaughter in California in the death of Michael Jackson. Just something you may not realize, in Kentucky, manslaughter is not a violent crime. So what do you think about that? You can be involved in someone's death and not actually be considered a violent criminal. At least that's how it is in Kentucky. So just a couple of topics that we're going to cover this week on In Touch. Let's start with Deputy Angelucci's death, right?
Well, in 1988, Joe Angelucci was sent out to Smith Street to serve a mental warrant on this William Bennett. And William Bennett had a history of having problems with the enforcement. And so Joe ended up having a struggle with this guy, and Joe was knocked to the ground. The guy reached down apparently and grabbed his service revolver and shot him right in the chest. And Joe died 18 days later. He was in the hospital for all of those days, and he died 18 days later. Now, this guy went to trial. I tried the case in 1989. I was the prosecutor, and he was sentenced. He was found guilty of murder, but mentally ill. And the jury sentenced him to 120 years. Now, what's the jury trying to say? They want that guy to be in prison the rest of his natural life. That's what they say.
So that means the jury heard the entire case,
right?
Every single word of it. Mm-hmm. They heard the argument from the defense that the guy was mentally ill. Mm-hmm. They determined that he was guilty of murder, but agreed that he was mentally ill.
Right.
And in spite of all of that, whatever the other mitigating factors were, made them decide that he needs to be in prison for 120 years. So they heard the whole case. They didn't say it wasn't this guy's fault because he was mentally ill. They said, no, we agree he had some mental issues, but based on everything that we have heard in this trial, in spite of it, the guy needs to spend 120 years in prison for murdering the sheriff's deputy. That's what the jury said.
That's right.
And now we fast forward. This was in 1988. We fast forward to today.
No, well, let me tell you. In 2000, this guy was up for parole, and Judge and Mrs. Angelucci and any number of people, including me, went over to the hearing in 2000, the victim parole hearing, where victims have an opportunity to express their opinion about this whole process. We went over there. They deferred his parole eligibility for 6 years. Then in 2006, we all troop over there again to talk about this guy's eligible for parole, right? And we did it again, and they deferred it for 10 years. So in 2006, he used to come up, 16, he used to come up again. Well, apparently the Department of Corrections has asked for this hearing to give him a medical release, meaning he must have some sort of medical issues, and as a result they want to release him. So we went over again in the last several days, and we'll find out in the next few days what they decide about that. But that's where we are now. Okay, so everybody's saying, well, you know, if he's sick, you know, why don't you just go ahead and let him out? You know, his family says he ought to be able to die at home. Well, so did Joe Angelucci. He shouldn't have been dead in the first place. But so what happens is that we go over there, and I'm opposed to it, and they're going to, the corrections cabinet, they've developed this whole new theory. It's called checkbook justice. And I'm sure they think, well, you know, we need to get this medical expense off our books. Well, who's going to pay for this guy's medical care anyway? So if we put him out, who's going to pay for it? You see, because people are given medical care if they need it in the United States, and it's going to be the taxpayers.
Taxpayers, one way or the other, are going to pay for it.
That's right.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's the thing that I keep going back to is if you're on a jury and you decide to unanimously agree to sentence someone to 120 years in prison, you have basically sentenced that person to die in prison. That's your intent if you're on that jury. And do not underestimate the fact that the jury, unlike, well, you were there, I wasn't there. The jury heard every single word of this testimony. They heard this
I was there.
I know you were, but they heard the defense. Yeah, you were there, but you're an advocate for the victims, an advocate for the criminal justice system. The jurors, they're impartial. They're just supposed to listen to the facts, and based on that, they made a decision. And we should respect that decision. In the same way that when juries find someone not guilty, we believe they're guilty, we still respect their decision, and that because it's important that we do things. And why do we respect the decision if they find someone not guilty? Because we assume they heard every single word of the trial, and they made the decision based on the facts. We weren't there for the whole trial, so we don't really have a right to second guess them. We're not in their shoes, and I agree with that totally. You know, as frustrating as it's been to me to see, you know, someone walk that you're involved in the case, and you know, as an investigator, this person did it. In the end, you put your head down and go, you know what? We did the best we can. The jury made the decision. All I'm asking is you do the same thing when they sentence someone to 120 years, and you say, okay, they've made their decision. Let's respect it.
Well, let me tell you the dirty little secret about this whole thing. We call it indeterminate sentencing in Kentucky. Now, what that means is that the jury goes through all of the things you just talked about. They listen to all the evidence, they make a decision, and they render a verdict, a recommendation to the judge that sat there in the trial. The judge then imposes a sentence, and it's almost always they impose the sentence recommended by the jury. Right, in this case 120 years. The jury thought he was getting 120 years. The judge thought he was getting 120 years. But you know, the dirty little secret in this indeterminate sentencing is that we have, it's called, in my opinion, a sentencing scam in Kentucky. The people that really decide how long people stay in prison is the parole board. These people are appointed, and they're the ones that make the decision about how long they're in. I've believed for a long time that we ought to abolish the parole board and let what the jury recommends and the judge imposes be the sentence. Now, we may have to adjust some of those to deal with space issues, but the fact of the matter is what a jury does, what a judge does, means nothing. It's the parole board that makes that decision, and it angers me every time I go over to a victim hearing for the parole board, because here we got an entire group of people that are basically being made to beg to keep somebody in prison that a jury recommended, in this case 120 years for.
Oh, and this is the family of these victims, which you have to deal with. You know, you may even ride to Frankfurt with them. I don't know when you go to this parole hearing, but you know, you can't look at a victim at the end of a trial and give him a wink and say, hey, you know, he's gone. You know, this phase of this is over for you, this phase, because you know it's not. It's never over.
I'll tell you something interesting. Brandy Derman, the wife of Brian Derman, who was the police officer that was run over and killed by Glenn Donahue, went to this. She went to support the Angelucci family, you know, because her husband, a law enforcement officer, like Deputy Sheriff Joe Angelucci, a law enforcement officer, was killed in the line of duty. So she was there to support them, but she watched this thing. And I said to her, I said, okay, you're going to be coming over here sometime soon. What do you think? And she says, I can't believe this. I cannot believe this. She was very discouraged about the process. And frankly, I don't blame her. It's just kind of it was, in my opinion, it's not a good day for the criminal justice system when we have juries, judges being absolutely disregarded and a group of appointees making a decision.
So you have this situation where this person was found guilty of murder, which is considered a violent crime in Kentucky still, thank goodness. But let's go to Dr. Conrad Murray in California, who, as you probably have heard by now, has been convicted in the death of Michael Jackson. And he's been convicted of manslaughter in California. Now, one of the things that we talk about and how they is how what the Kentucky laws consider to be a violent and nonviolent crime. And I always thought the example of attempted murder is not considered to be violent under Kentucky laws, which has a big factor in the sentencing and how long someone has to serve. Because if you are convicted of a violent crime, you have to serve 85% now under Kentucky law. If it's considered nonviolent, like attempted murder, it can be released in 15 or 20%.
But either one, depending on the degree of the crime.
So that's another way that they run the sentencing scam. And so Dr. Conrad Murray, that's a case here, been convicted of manslaughter, and had this been in Kentucky, I think he was sentenced to 4 years.
Right, and so you got a number of things working on this one. Number one, California is pushing people, has been required by some federal judge to release anywhere from 33 to 45,000 prisoners because of overcrowding. And so what's going to happen? How much time is this guy going to actually serve on this 4-year sentence? Probably not much. But it's just an example of somebody being convicted of taking another person's life, causing another person's death, that's going to get basically not much punishment. And it's people are beginning to get discouraged. The crime rate continues to rise in our community, and most people, Officer Don, like you and me, were raised with this idea that if you violate the law or break the rules, you're going to suffer consequences. And we're starting to see that be eroded significantly. And the only message that I think we're seeing coming out of this whole criminal justice system and the process of releasing people or not sending them in the first place is this message loud and clear: crime pays. It's very discouraging.
And the argument that
Tune in to the following stations every Sunday to hear full episodes of In Touch with Ray the DA and Don Evans.